Good evening everybody, and welcome to a special video. We're going to celebrate Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, being the 8th of May. It's the liberation of Europe, and we're going to analyse the amazing film Downfall, and its explanation of the last 10 days of the war, not just the last 10 days of Hitler's life, but the actual end of the war. Look at Hitler's time in power, and why he chose to die in the bunker, and leave his people to die, despite talking about them as if they were his family during his life. Before we dive into the film itself, I want to give some context to Hitler as an individual and what we can learn from the Nazis' rise and how we can prevent people trying to follow in his goose steps recently happening by authoritarian regimes that are hostile towards the media, who won't bow down to themselves, and attacking the judiciary, and any sort of naysayers will be just dismissed out of hand. We need to tackle this in modern day as well as back then and learn the lessons of history. So let's go through some of the details. So in specifics, I really want to pick this up from the beer putsch that Hitler attempted in 1923, when Hitler was able to call upon the support of people like General Ludendorff, one of the World War II generals, beside General Hindenburg, who's obviously the person that allows Hitler to get into power further down as President Hindenburg, to advocate for the overthrow of the democratic Weimar government and trying to lead a violent revolution at the time. What led him to this place? Well, Hitler had a few things in his life that came to make a huge part of his design, of his ideology and mentality. So he lost his mother when he was young and had a very abusive father and left home. Now, part of this played into the fact that Hitler's mother was diagnosed and to death underneath a Jewish doctor. How much that actually plays in towards his future anti-Semitism is a bit hard to judge. But he wanted to go and live out his dream of being an artist because Hitler was all about dreams, and his mum was very supportive in that regard of it. So he tried to make a living after famously failing to get into the Vienna School of Art, but failed. He ended up living in hostels and doss houses and barely surviving. And it was whilst he was here in Vienna that he picks up the violent anti-Semitic ideology of the city at the time. Though he still had Jewish patrons at this period for his postcard art and his art that he sold just in general, it's where the spark was ignited in terms of putting the idea into his head. It's where he first saw the swastika in use, and after collecting his father's inheritance, he decided to move to Munich not long prior to World War I. I'll show the photograph of him standing in the Munich crowd at this point here. It's in this period of nationalistic fervour where Hitler eagerly joins the army, like so many young men wanting to go to the front, whipped up into that sort of nationalism, whether you're in the UK, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire even, it doesn't matter. They chose to join up, something that would no longer be the case by about 1915, where conscription would be coming on all sides. Now, while he would later reframe what he did as a corporal here, he was actually a courier at the front. Still an incredibly brave thing to do, to go and send over the messages when you consider the effects it could have being shot at, etc. during the war. But it wasn't the frontline action he wanted to be involved in. However, he got given his Iron Cross for a particularly daring mission where he managed to deliver a mission under severe bombardment where two other people in the same group died. It was a Jewish superior that actually recommended him for his Iron Cross, so it shows even at this point that Hitler's anti-Semitic fervour that comes after isn't fully there yet, or isn't fully formed. The couple of missions after, he then is affected by a gas attack which ends his war because he went blind in late 1917 and wasn't ever able to return to the front as Germany lose. That's really important because him not being there proved crucial for his buying into the fact that Germany was robbed by insurgents inside its own system, and one such group were the Jews. According to the right-wing groups that were round about in Germany prior and after the war, and they never ever accepted the loss despite the German starvation of over 1 million people in 1917 after the turnip harvest failed and the economic poverty at home. This anger at the loss of war still didn't have a direct link to what would follow. It was just a step on the path towards it.
It would grow and flourish into Nazism in the south of Germany.
After the war, Hitler was working for a group called the Freikorps. Now, the Freikorps was made up of German army people, but it was a paramilitary group in all intents and purposes, fighting the communists all over Germany. Munich itself had a thing called the Räterepublik after the war, which is a communist government which ran Munich for a few months before being disbanded violently. The Freikorps were one of the people to do it. Of the 10 leaders 8 were Jewish, and the far right seized upon this with more rhetoric about the links between Bolshevism and Judaism. And this was incredibly prevalent in places like Austria and Bavaria, so the two parts of Germany and Austria where Hitler had a huge effect on this. And Hitler was asked to spy on what was then the little known DAP, or Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. He was impressed by their rhetoric, and when asked to speak, he recognised he had an innate ability, one that would be paid for extremely well. Bear in mind that this is a person that lived in doss houses and was extremely poor to it. And as it grew, and as his ability to whip people up grew, he seized the party for himself, creating what is now known as the swastika flag. And he used the red to fool socialists and communists, to try and fool people that didn't know better about it, and the black swastika representing the far right, or the nationalistic idea, and she reframed her name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the National Socialisten Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or for short, the Nazi Party. So to try and gather as many votes as possible, they tried to appeal to all sides, but they did remain in irrelevance throughout this period, despite the brutality created by the stormtroopers, or Sturmabteilung, or SA should I say, what stands for Storm Division. Now, in 1923, Hitler thought he would have to seize power, and so they tried to do so after a beer hall meeting, which included people like General Ludendorff, and that's why it's referred to as the beer hall putsch, because it was created in these places. The thing about it is, it failed. Many Nazis actually lost their life on the day. Hitler himself, with 2 people beside him, were killed. He was very fortunate and ran away. When the military and the police refused to join it, they thought they would join sides and march on the German Weimar capital, but that didn't happen. So Hitler ran and got arrested a few days later into it, which leads us into his famous trial and his eventual imprisonment at Landsberg prison. And in the trial he had this speech.
May pronounce us guilty 1,000 times, but the goddess who presides over the eternal court of history will, with a smile, tear in pieces the charge of the public prosecutor and the verdict of this court.
This is a speech that's went down in history as Hitler's incredibly brave ideas and stance. The thing is, he was emboldened to make so about divine providence and all these parts for it, because he knew something many in the court didn't know, that the judge, Georg Neidhart, had already given him a softer sentence just 6 months before for committing crimes done under the SA banner, so he knew the court would be lenient. But the speech garnered him more attention, and it's in his prison time that he writes Mein Kampf, his quite frankly ludicrous manifesto into his own ideology. I also like the fact that on the Annihilation mix of Frankie Goes to Hollywood, 2 Tribes Go to War, that they actually get Ronald Reagan, or Chris Barry, as I found out, Arnold Rimmer, to read the statement from that beer putsch trial as in talking about the Christian overtake of society, something that Frank Zappa also has a statement about, which I'll link in the description below. After his release in 1928, the Nazis ran in the election, and for a vote share of just 2.8%, still a complete irrelevance politically, but fortune would change for him, further strengthening his belief that he was a messianic being for the German people and created by providence and divinity. This was the Wall Street crash in 1929. It ruined economies all around the world, but Germany was the worst affected, as they had mortgaged large American loans to pay off the reparations owed to the war for France and the UK, something that the Americans had argued against and therefore had allowed the Germans to borrow money from them. And so hyperinflation absolutely destroyed the German economy as they recalled these loans. And in this period of people struggling to survive, they looked towards the extremes, with both communist and far-right parties gaining. But the Nazis went in 1930 to 25% of the vote. A lot of this on the back of Hitler's flight over Germany just prior to this, where he challenged President Hindenburg, and Goebbels created the idea that Hitler would fly all over Germany to go and see people in small villages and small towns. It's a very revolutionary idea, and one of the reasons that they were forward thinking. But in 1932, 1933, just as the German economy was recovering and the Nazis had just stopped being able to fight the elections and dropped in vote and going bankrupt at the same time, He was handed power purely by chance, really, offered at first by General Schleicher to be vice president to von Papen's government, and when he refused to do that and they deposed von Papen by walking out, he then was offered the position of being chancellor by von Papen himself, who obviously crowed at the time, "We have hired him." Terrible, terrible words to look back on. And this is something that is getting reflected back into politics now all over the world. As people feel poor and more disenfranchised, they start to look to extremes for answers rather than looking towards the political establishment, because they feel like establishment has failed them, rightly or wrongly. It doesn't matter. You still need to make a stand at the part of it, and that's something we're struggling to see now. And so for a man who'd always believed that they would need to seize power, it was another sign it was meant to happen. I won't go over the entirety of the Nazis' time, but rather highlight things of Hitler as an individual. As well, a movie was made about Klaus von Stauffenberg's attempt, Valkyrie, an attempt on Hitler's life. He actually had two other ones, three I think, if I actually include another, but I'm not going to include that because I don't have the details to hand. But basically, after one, he banned the trade unions in 1934, and it was a local carpenter, angry at what he'd done, put a bomb into a pillar. And Hitler was incredibly fortunate to survive the bomb that went off. He just happened to be slightly out of place in another time, and in 1938, although that was stopped a little bit earlier. Hitler still was fortunate to survive such a thing, but they caught it just before somebody went to throw the grenade at him. Every time he survived, it could just strengthened his idea that he was destined to do this. The same with victory in France. A low-level officer suggested going through the Ardennes to Guderian's blitzkrieg plan that had already been written in 1935. And Hitler said it was his own idea, when angered by the generals later on in the war, something that's reflected in the film and I'll show up here. And every success was always his, while every failure was somebody else's. You see again, in the modern day, there's many parallels to exactly that idea. And as the war goes on, Hitler spent almost all of his time at the Wolf's Lair, which is just outside modern day Ukraine, away from his people and his rallies. And as they lost, he withdrew even more from his public life, happy to take the adulation of the annexation of Austria or victory in France, but unwilling to talk as things got bad. And this, I think, is key to understand why he ends up in the bunker in a totally unreal and surreal situation, being told exactly what he wants to hear with total power, unquestioned power, as he'd either purged those who'd stood against him, or used what charisma and the belief he was superhuman and divine to coax people into believing a miracle was possible, despite there being absolutely no opportunity for that to happen. And as he lost, he accelerated the final solution enormously, killing more and more. So as the Red Army closed in and started to push the war back, they murdered around about 2.5 to 3 million people in less than 2 years. Somewhere like Treblinka, they killed 800,000 people in something like 5 months, 6 months. It's unthinkable. And so when he ran out of people outside of this to kill, people that were no longer outside of control, he no longer could do it. He turned his anger on his own people, as those were the people who'd abandoned him, and proven his neo-Darwinian theory that the weak will perish and the strong will survive. A complete misreading, obviously, of Darwinian thinking, but that was the way that Hitler saw the world. Okay, so now I've given some baseline context to what Adolf Hitler's, why he believed in such divinity, why he thought of a certain way. I didn't want to delve too much into parts of his anti-Semitism, because it is incredibly difficult to identify exactly where it comes in. It's more of a kind of staggering part of it, recognising it can make him money, recognising it can channel his anger and make him popular was something that obviously appealed to him, just on a personal level. And now that I've done that, I would like to take a look at the aspects of the film more closely. If you want me to go over any further details in terms of the regime, elements of it, then I'm more than happy to do so and follow up with a short video. I'll go through some of the details of it. I just thought I'd keep this one a little bit more concise. I actually cut a fair bit out of my script for this one because it was a little bit too unwieldy, and I thought that this would be better served being slightly more on point. Anyway, as I go off point and talk about something else, let's get back on track. So, for me, this is one of the most historically accurate films ever made. It's incredibly good. It's taken from two books, Inside the Hitler's Bunker by the historian Joachim Fest, and Until the Final Hour by Traul Junge, who was one of Hitler's personal secretaries from 1942, and she's given many interviews over the years. I shall play some from The World at War here, and I might include a little bit from Downfall's own background as well, just to explain some of the details and let you hear it from her own voice.
Ding bös sein muss oder dass ich ihm nicht verzeihen kann, dass es die Schrecken, dieses Monster nicht rechtzeitig erkannt hat, dass es nicht durchschaut hat, in was es da hineingeraten ist und vor allem, dass ich so unüberlegt ja gesagt habe. Ich war ja keine begeisterte Nationalsozialistin. Ich hätte ja, als ich dann nach Berlin kam, sagen können, nein, ich will da nicht mitmachen und ich will auch nicht ins Führerhauptquartier geschickt werden. Ich habe es aber nicht gemacht, aber da war die Neugier so groß und irgendwie habe ich das auch nicht so, ich habe ja nicht gedacht, dass mich das Schicksal so vorantreibt, an eine Stelle, die ich überhaupt nicht angestrebt habe. Und trotzdem, es fällt mir schwer, mir das zu verzeihen.
So the film itself starts from Hitler's birthday, which is the 20th of April, and at this party, the last remnants of the Nazi hierarchy all come, despite most of them very much wishing not to risk themselves to come here. There's a brilliant part called The Nazi Rise to Power on BBC iPlayer. I highly suggest watching it. It's a four series sort of thing. It's incredible. It goes into such brilliant detail about all of this if you want to learn a little bit more. Many had tried to convince Hitler to leave, including Himmler, Speer. Göring so much didn't really care. He was too drug-addled at this point to care about anything. But he refused. He was unwilling to go on because he was struggling physically and mentally, taking roughly 28 injections a day from Dr. Morell, including speedball of cocaine and morphine, is one of the things described in Norman Ohler's book and Professor Ian Kershaw's fantastic double biography on Hitler himself, covering the entirety of his life. So what he kept doing and kept saying in the film, and this is exactly like real life, is that they would be saved by Providence. He believed that there was army units that would come in to save him, in reality that didn't exist. They would push the horde back, just as Frederick the Great had done when it seemed like they were going to lose to Russia. And if you see in the film here, I'll put in the background the frame of the portrait hanging in his office, which is what he had. We then are introduced to Peter Franz, one of the children, is receiving an Iron Cross in Hitler's last public appearance. Obviously, again, from the photograph, this is a real thing that actually happened. And from here, what we see is Hitler living in a fantasy. As Junge says, it's like a dream, but in reality, it's a nightmare, with people finally questioning Hitler, and the betrayal of both Göring, which didn't affect him so much because he was always done, but Himmler, his most loyal adjutant, reaching out to the West. That broke him, and once he'd lost that loyal assistant, he knew things were over. From here, he wants the entirety of Germany to suffer. He's already told Speer months before this to destroy all of Germany earlier in the film, and repeats this at the end. Although there's an amazing bit of detail in this which I'd like to draw your attention to. So when we're first introduced to Speer, we see him do what he did with Hitler most of all, which is building the models. Hitler talking about how many hours have we spent in these models, and you'll see him clearly in his brown Nazi uniform. But yet when he comes out to tell Hitler that he's not carried out his order and the destruction of everything in the country's infrastructure to send it back to the medieval age, he is dressed in a suit. And this is a real thing that happened because Speer, being the armaments minister, knew they were losing, and he wanted to save his own neck. And he needed something to show the Allies that he disobeyed Hitler with a little bit of paperwork. And also he knew there was a lot less with his actual name on it to prove what he'd directly done, because he'd been very clever over the last number of months when he was committing his own crimes, and recognised his opportunity not to be punished for the crimes of the regime and dress as a civilian to say, hey, I was just an architect. He apologised for the crimes of the regime at Nuremberg, and saying he knew nothing about it all was an enormous lie. He had personally worked at least 120,000 people to death in his factories towards the end of the war, and was one of Hitler's closest confidants, to the point where when he tried to distance himself at the Nuremberg trials, Göring visibly laughs at the preposterous claim, knowing exactly what Speer had done. That's the level of detail the film takes in. It's absolutely immaculate in the way that it reports and talks about all of these elements in terms of the detail of the specifics that happen to bring a reality to the film that rarely exists in such films. The last one I covered was Das Boot, and that also manages the same thing, to bring a sort of reality to the situation that these people are in. In this case, a very different type of person or people. And it shows just how much they studied to go through the real life counterparts, how much attention was spent on everything that they did in it. It's something that I found extremely good watching it again, having a little bit more knowledge from when I first saw this film in 2005 myself these days. And I also want to particularly look at Bruno Ganz. I've got an extra and a DVD to let him describe in his own words first what he was aiming for in his portrayal of Hitler here.
So ein Ding, das ist einmal im Leben. Ich meine, es ist gar nicht einfach etwas so Merkwürdiges wie Hitler zu spielen, weil sonst denke ich, wenn das zu einem kommt, dann eher wird eine Parodie verlangt oder so etwas. Aber das wirklich so zentral und realistisch. Und da habe ich einfach ganz simpel wie ein Schauspieler ehrgeizig reagiert und gedacht, ja klar, das mache ich. Natürlich, da muss man über bestimmte moralische Skrupel und so Sachen springen und sagen, also. Aber das, ich weiß nicht, entweder man traut sich das zu, dass man autonom genug ist und halt auch einen Massenmörder spielt, weil auch das, um das banal zu sagen, halt ein Mensch ist.
Actually makes what he does even more reprehensible, because he knew what he was doing was absolutely terrible. He could have some humanity for people he liked and cared about, but his hatred for groups transcended his own humanity, which only a few people actually got to see. So one such group were the Goebbels family, and that was why they decided to kill their own children, so as not to live in a world without National Socialism. To understand, Hitler had personally saved their marriage more than once from Goebbels' domestic abuse and adultery, which he'd done. And Magda Goebbels saw herself as, or she was seen as, the First Lady of the Reich, since Hitler was never intended to be married, something that Eva Braun wanted to be, and that's part of the reason of her motivation to stay beside him till the end, because she wanted to be seen in posterity as this noble martyr to the cause, because they genuinely believed the cause would come back in some way, shape or form. And it turns out in modern days that seems to be more likely than not. Eva Braun herself was locked in a gilded cage her entire time with Hitler, just as he'd done with his niece Gaily Robel, and that was in the 1930s, where he was romantically involved with her. It was his sister's daughter. He moved her away from his sister to Germany and made sure that our house, after she committed suicide in Hitler's own private property, after Hitler had scolded her for having an affair with his driver, he insisted that her room was never touched by his sister, who absolutely despised Hitler by this point, especially after what he'd done with the family since he'd left back in those days, back in the early 1900s. And so she stayed because it was all she knew. And the film also shows how many people chose to end their lives when Hitler died. It's incredible to think, but they felt unable to manage without the leader, and that there was zero point in going on. So many ordinary Germans committed suicides, and tens to hundreds of thousands of people killed themselves, scared of what the Russians would do after decades of propaganda against the Asiatic hordes. Some of them went, and it's a terrible story of people being dragged into the water, mothers taking their children and drowning themselves in the river as the Russians are coming towards them. And as the film shows as well, the crimes against people in Germany exponentially rose as the Nazis lost territory and lost the ability to punish anybody else. Anybody that wouldn't take the Führer's ultimate destruction was killed by people favourable to Hitler, or people that were in favour of Hitler being around. So far, that they killed people even after he died. And this brings me on to another thing I would like to tackle while talking about such a brilliant film. There is no doubt that Adolf Hitler shot himself and killed himself on the 30th. He was burned in the right chancery. Despite any ridiculous conspiracy theory about him escaping, he didn't want to leave. He believed absolute destruction was the only answer and didn't want to be questioned and put on a trial to answer for the crimes that he knew he'd committed. He knew what was coming for him if he'd stayed around. They found not only his jawbone, but many witnesses were there to explain what happened, and they had no reason to fabricate anything, especially when individually questioned. They all have the same explanation in great detail of what happened when in the bunker. This film is a great retort to any such ideas. It shows the level of detail taken and explained how it corroborates later trial testimony at Nuremberg to make sure the perpetrators pay for their horrific, unimaginable crimes to humanity. And bringing it to life on the screen, it serves as a piece of history to document this event and to remind everyone that even people who seem human in public and seem to share the same sensitivities as ourselves can commit such atrocious crimes, and why we should always be wary of those attacking the law, attacking people trying to tell the truth, or creating just large groups of enemies or dangers to the state instead of recognising their humanity and trying best to aid them, no matter what that facilitates itself as. I never ever want to see this repeated, but some lessons have clearly not been learnt from this period, so let's remind people of our own humanity and consider what we do, not just what we say when it comes to other people. And now to end this video, I want to celebrate the end of the war. Today, 80 years ago, for Victory in Europe Day, tomorrow will be celebrated in Russia, the country that fought the hardest and that lost the most to actually make it happen. Something which Donald Trump just very recently, as I finished this script, and literally the day I did it, the news came out that he decided that Victory, or VE Day, no longer needs to be that. It's Victory Day in World War II, Veterans Day is Victory Day in World War I, eradicating the Nagasaki bomb and basically trying to downplay Europe's enormous role in fighting the Nazis. The reality of things are, to remind somebody like Donald Trump, is that Germany declared war on America, not the other way round. The American Senate was tied on whether to declare war. Roosevelt was saved an absolute nonsense of having to go through and trying to get people to be on side to intervene in another European war as they argued for against it. Bear in mind that Roosevelt ran his election campaign just prior to the Second World War on being not intervening in European politics or another European war. So the American politics didn't make it very clear. Japan they were happy to vote for, but they didn't vote for it in Europe. And thankfully Hitler did the opposite way around to save us that from all. Not to downplay the enormity of the American industrial might and how much effect that had on winning the war. But it's the Russians that sacrificed 25 million soldiers and civilians to gain the ground that won it. Another thing I'd like to add is that the person that placed the flag on top of the Reichstag was a female major, because in the Russian army both men and women fought. I've got a particularly brilliant story about the Russian tank woman, the woman who lost her husband and fought a tank, but I'm going to save that for a little when I'm going to cover some more of the kind of stranger stories from the war. Now, I'm also considering covering the relationship between Nazi billionaires after I finish the plutonium files, which I'm working on for next month. I've had it on in the background. I've just been a little bit distracted by a few things in my private life, etc. So I do apologise, but I am working on the second part of that. And I was absolutely overwhelmed by the response to Das Boot. It was really satisfying to me that people enjoyed that so much. And as a creator, I can't say thank you enough. It really helped me a lot to focus on what I might want to do in the future. Have a great VE Day, and let's remember all the fallen that have died in any war. As I pointed out about the Kriegsmarine, the people that went to war weren't necessarily one side or the other or chose, they were just people that were sent to die. Those are people that died to give us our own freedom, and for us to protect that freedom and make sure that we look after what we have in our democracies, something we are trying to erode slowly. I don't mean to be too with too strong a rhetoric into this point, sorry, stumbling over my words, but trying to get it to come out. But I just feel really passionately about democracy being the most important way forward, and not to allow jackboots to step back in again. And they don't march in, they move slowly to get there. That's what this film is trying to remind people, that even human beings can create and do horrible things, horrible states. I really hope you enjoyed my little review. What I've decided to do is give us some games to celebrate at the end of the video, so I'm going to play out. You can stop watching now if that's your thing. If not, then have a little look at some suggestions, some games you might want to play to celebrate this incredibly momentous day. I would love to do something for Victory in Japan in a similar mould, but I don't know where to start that one. So I'll have a think about that. But thank you very much for your time. Take care and goodbye.
Lift raised. Get going.